There's been a lot of focus these days, both from the legislature, from the media, and from taxpayers, on how public bodies conduct their meetings. And that renewed focus and scrutiny has resulted in a lot of administrative extra work, quite frankly, for personnel, whether it be from the town manager's office or just from the administrative staff level for folks who work for different boards. So we want to go over some basics, but things that maybe are not self-evident when it comes to posting meetings of public bodies and maintaining meeting minutes. And it's extra important these days because the laws in this regard has changed back in 2010. And we all kind of had a bit of a grace period for a few years while we got used to the new laws. But now that we're 5 years out from the law changing, as I said, we are seeing a very renewed focus and scrutiny on how we do things. So that's part of the reason why we're coming in and having this discussion today. Now, because the topic is not one that you would normally sit there and say, wow, this is going to be scintillating. This does work better if it's a bit of a dialogue, so feel free to stop me, ask me questions. I've had some amount of caffeine this morning, but just nearly not enough for this rainy day, so please feel free, stop me, ask me questions as we go. Everybody hear me okay? I'm in a mic because we are taping this, so anything you don't want recorded for posterity, keep it to yourself, okay, folks? Just a quick swing through on the handouts. As Erica said, you have several handouts. One are the slides from this presentation, so you don't have to take down every word. You have a copy of the slides. I've also given you folks a couple of checklists from the Attorney General. I'll explain a little bit why the AG cares about posting meetings and taking meeting minutes. I've also given you a couple sample templates for meeting minutes themselves. And finally, I've given you what we use as a checklist for how to go into executive session. I want to take a quick poll. How many folks here are actually minute takers or responsible for maintaining minutes? And how many folks are from particular boards? Okay, great. I thank you all for coming. The open meeting law, which is one of the main laws we're going to talk about today, does put on board chairs in particular a significant responsibility, additional responsibilities than you ever really had in the past. And we are going to go over those today. So folks that have been longtime board or committee members, some of these things may be a little bit new, or the way that we talk about them now may be a little different than you're used to, okay? So, of course, the disclaimer, right? If you have a specific question, please contact administration, and if it's appropriate, they'll contact town council's office, right? Because we'd rather get it right first time than have to try and correct something after the fact if we haven't gotten it correct. So the comments that I make to you today are meant to be general overview comments. I am happy we'll have question and answer at the end if folks have some specific issues that they want to address. But when in doubt, right, always a good idea to contact administration, and they can make the determination whether it's appropriate to get town council involved to respond to your question. So as I said, the open meeting law changed in 2010. The changes were effective July 1st, 2010. How many people have ever heard of what I'm talking about? Okay, no, that's not so bad. The open meeting law is what governs how public bodies, boards, committees, commissions, how they do their meetings. And the presumption is everything is supposed to be in the open, in a meeting, not via email, not via telephone call, not when you're at the coffee shop, right? So the open meeting law is meant to make government transparent, quite frankly. We hear a lot about that. And effective July 1st, 2010, there were new rules that went into effect for how public bodies conduct their business, how they convene open meetings, the minute-taking requirements, how they post notice of their meetings. And one of the big changes that came in was that the Attorney General became the overseer for the open meeting law. Before then, it used to be each district attorney for the various different counties. And so one district attorney may have a different interpretation than another. So with everything moving to a central administrative agency, there's a division of open government now within the Attorney General's office. There's a central, arbiter, basically, of open meeting law issues. And at the same time, by consolidating everything with the Attorney General, they also created an administrative complaint process, which didn't exist before. And so I don't know how many of you have experienced an open meeting law complaint, but there are folks, who not even taxpayers of your town, who will go and look at meeting agendas, look at video of local cable access broadcasts of public board meetings to see if in some manner the open meeting law was violated, and will file complaints. And this is really, when I talk about sort of the increase in administrative time that's necessary to deal with these issues, it's because of this administrative complaint process. I'll talk a little bit about what that process entails from a public body perspective in a minute. Media, you may not follow this, but the news media thinks that government, by and large, we're hiding something. So there is a constant focus on wanting to ensure, acting as a watchdog, they might say, that when we have to give up records, when they ask us for public records, we give them to them, and that our meetings are held in accordance with the open meeting law. And so the media really does, they take a great interest in this, and they're a pretty powerful lobby. So when we don't do things that we're supposed to, whether or not it's the subject of a newspaper article or whatnot, it does, again, create that climate or that atmosphere for legislative change. Right now, the public records law, which you may or may not be familiar with, there's several pending legislative bills that are being pushed by the news media to make things much more restrictive, quite frankly, for governmental bodies in terms of how they respond to public records requests. And that's all because really being driven by the media. So this stuff is important. It may not seem like it because it's not the actual business. It's what your board or commission is charged with doing. But there are real reasons why we want you to be mindful of it. I've given you the statutory citations to the open meeting law and the Attorney General regulations. You don't need to memorize chapter and verse, but I wanted you to have the reference if you need it. If anybody is still referring to the old open meeting law, which is General Laws Chapter 39, Section 23, A and B, in your meeting minutes or your meeting notices, you need to stop. The 30A, Section 18 through 25 is the correct citation. If you are putting on your meeting notices executive sessions, you will see on the executive session card I gave you the correct statutory cite, 30A, Section 21A, and then an exemption. How many boards ever go into executive session? It's not terribly common for most boards. Board of Selectmen, land use boards, those are the ones that most frequently go into executive session for a variety of reasons, but one of which is that most often the ones involved in litigation, and that is a basis for executive session. Capital Planning Committee, I don't know that they're doing executive session all that much, but I will touch upon it a little bit for folks because it is important when you get to how you prepare your meeting notice. Talked about the public records law. Meeting minutes, meeting agendas, not only the content and the form being governed by the open meeting law, but how we maintain them and how we make them available are covered by the public records law as well. So I've given you those citations. Again, not for you to memorize, but just so you have it as a reference in case you need it. Okay. So how much notice do you need to give before a meeting? Counting Saturdays and Sundays? No. Counting holidays? When the open meeting law was changed July 2010, the addition of Saturday as the period that you don't count your 48 hours was added. So that was a big change and I think most folks have gotten used to that change when you're calculating your meeting notice. These are the questions that we ask when we look at your meeting agenda. Was it posted timely? Was it posted in the correct location? Does it have the requisite detail? And if you are having an executive session, have you properly referred to it? Before the law changed, you'd put up a notice saying the Conservation Commission's having a meeting, X state. Maybe you had more detail in it. But when the law changed, it required now that you put in more detail in your meeting notice. And so for all intents and purposes, the meeting notice and an agenda really have merged into one. So the expectation is under the law that when you post your meeting, you're going to give pretty much the same level of detail that you would if you were doing a separate agenda for the board or committee members themselves, okay? And I'll go through exactly what the statute requires in terms of notice. Minutes, okay? Sure, go ahead.
I have a question with respect to the detail. So as an example, if a board has an application pending before it, say whether it's the Conservation Commission, Planning, HTC, whatnot, and it's simply an applicant's name listed, does that mean detail, or for every application that's pending before a board, would it be expected to list the applicant's name and the subject matter that's pending, that is the subject of the application?
So the question had to do with the content, the level of detail in the meeting notice. Is an applicant's name sufficient or some other type of information? Usually with the land use boards, the Attorney General would like you to include the property location. Do I have any assessors here? No. Tax abatements are different, okay? We'll talk about, if folks from the assessors ever, because this is being recorded, they may be watching this, we can talk about that. That's separate. There are some confidentiality rules that deal with tax abatements. But for a land use permit, usually you'd put developer name, property address. If there's a name of the development that's been floated, you'd put that too.
That's fine. You don't have to say for a certain...
Well, if your board has different types of permits, yeah, I'd put A&R, I'd put subdivision, application for subdivision approval or something along those lines of level of detail. You'll see in one of the other slides, what the law requires is that you give enough detail that someone who knows nothing about you picks up the agenda and is going to say, oh, I know what they're going to be talking about, right? And, a lot of times folks, but this is the way we've always done it, right? Everyone knows that when we say X, Y, Z, that this is what we mean. And these days, we like you to err on the side of over-inclusion to some extent, unless there's some privacy concerns, which would be an occasion for you to have a discussion with administration. We like you to include more detail than less, okay? Minutes. So your minutes must be accurate, must be a fair summary of the discussion that occurred. They do not need to be a verbatim transcript. This is under the open meeting law. I will say to you that for those boards that conduct, and this usually is land use boards, but could be licensing boards as well, if you're acting on a permit application or a license application, you may really want more detail in your minutes, and we do tend to recommend more detail because that's really the record of why you did what you did. And for those folks that issue licenses and permits, you know that your decisions can often be appealed to court, and we look to the meeting minutes as part of the justification for why you did what you did. Okay, so when I say verbatim transcripts aren't required, that is under the open meeting law, and I'll repeat this as we go on a little further. There may be other legal requirements or reasons why you might want to have more detail, but it is so common for me to see minutes that say, Jane said, and John said, and so said, and that's one way to keep minutes. Not necessarily how I would always recommend it, but it can be easy from the perspective of someone who's listening to a tape or watching a video of a meeting to just type it in that fashion.
What's the status of the audio or video recordings relative to minutes if there ends up being a dispute or litigation?
So the minutes are the official record, but if there is, I often do look to the cable access broadcasts if I have a question. I mean, technically, minutes are the record, right? And depending on the type of litigation that is being brought, there may or may not be room to introduce an actual video recording. And just to repeat the question had to do with, what is the status of audio or video recordings of meetings in terms of vis-a-vis the minutes. If you haven't completed your minutes, they haven't been approved, they're still in draft form, you may be required to turn over the drafts, and if there's a tape, you may be required to turn over the tape as well. How many folks do tape their meetings? It's a fairly common practice. I have no problem with it. Just be aware that at some point, you may be asked to turn over those tapes. There's no requirement that you maintain that tape after the minutes have been finalized and approved. I know a lot of folks do reuse audio tapes. The one thing I'll put my litigation hat on, if you know or you think something is going to be in litigation, we do tell you to hold on to those tapes. Because they may be useful or not, depending on what's on them. But typically when a case goes into litigation, you're supposed to preserve any records that relate to that particular subject matter. Yes.
I think you're using an antiquated term. I don't know about what other boards use, but I know that most people are using digital recordings.
The same would be so the comment had to do with whether the proper nomenclature. This would include digital recordings. You're ahead of the curve, quite frankly. I mean, I have many towns that, I'll get an actual audio cassette from the town as to what they recorded their meeting, and I have to go to the secret locked closet in the basement of the office to get a tape player, because a lot of times I am able to get from them an actual digital recording. I can't help. That's. There is no general recommendation about how long to keep the digital or audio or video recordings of of the meetings. You have to keep them at least until the official minutes are approved.
So you should probably be telling us that you should save all copies of everything instead of just waiting for litigation when a copy may not exist digitally. I mean, for a tape, yes, you save the tape, you put it away in a box, there it is. But I know there are people that keep digital records, that do digital recording of meetings, and you don't always have that. So
That's right. You don't always have it. And I'm not saying to you that a digital audio video recording is required under the open meeting law, okay? But folks, as a matter of practice, a lot of folks do record in some fashion their meetings, whether it is because it's being broadcast on the local cable access or because they're recording it for their own purposes for preparing for the minutes. And at the minimum, obviously, they have to be kept until the minutes are approved. After that, it's really an internal discussion about what your system capabilities are. Do you want to periodically burn them onto a disk? That's more of an internal type of discussion. And again, land use boards may be a little different than some of the other boards, or licensing. Any permit granting board may be in a different position than some of the other boards because you're more likely to be involved in litigation than otherwise.
I think it was heard to say that there's no open meeting law requirement relative to either videotaping or audio recording a meeting of the committee or commission. Yet we're being instructed that we have to video record and or audio record our committee meeting. Is that on the advice of council, or is that simply the administration of the town that's choosing to put that requirement?
So usually that is a policy determination. There's a couple different things that go on. One can be cable access, right? There's a determination that gets made between cable and administration about what board and committee meetings are able to be broadcast. So sometimes there's requirements, those requirements will be put in place to ensure that whatever you need for either cable access, live streaming. I have many communities that are doing live or delayed streaming of public meetings. So obviously there needs to be a recording for that. Erica, do you want to weigh in?
I just want to add that you are not, you're not required by law to do that. The Board of Selectmen, who makes most of the appointments in the town, I know they don't, there's some regulatory boards that
And so just to repeat the question and the response for the purpose of the video, there was a question that was raised about where or from where does a policy derive about requiring recordings of meetings. And as Erica indicated, that's through a selectman policy. And, you know, transparency, accessibility of the government is a huge topic. You know, people talk about it across the state at the government level. How do we make ourselves accessible and available to the public? And with today's technology, it is so much easier. You know, the flip side is, of course, you know, now we're right front and center on video. I don't watch myself on cable access because I don't like to see it, but I could, any given time, Google myself and find some meeting that I was in attendance at. And from a lawyer's perspective, I'll tell you that in representing cities and towns, it can be very helpful to us because I'm able to access so much more in this new, you know, digital age than I was otherwise, and it helps me make evaluations and judgments that I can't always. They're much more informed than they might be when I'm looking at a simple piece of paper.
Since this was separate from what they've been asking, I deferred. It has to do with posting of minutes. We, in our particular committee, believe that people want to see the minutes as quickly as we produce them. And so we send them to the help desk as soon as they've been internally reviewed, but not approved, because approval takes the next meeting. In other words, we get them out within a week.
Bravo. That's great.
If there is a change, then we substitute. Otherwise, we just leave them. The question is that okay?
So the question had to do with the posting, if you will. Do you folks actually post those online to the town website? So posting of meeting minutes before they've been formally approved. Make sure that they have the word draft on them. Okay? Okay? And then once they're approved, they should have a notation approved versus draft.
They should be redone to say, take the draft off, so that people know that they're fine.
Yeah, I do that for the permanent record. I must admit I've been lazy and I have trouble with the help desk to substitute something that doesn't have a watermark versus one that did have a watermark.
I mean, I personally just find it confusing when there's multiple sets of minutes. I think it's better to have the final set, but
Unless there's an internal requirement to get the draft minutes up, I tend to be with Erica that I'd want the final minutes. And if you are turning them around that quickly, then I don't know that it's it's certainly not an open meeting law issue to wait till the next meeting for it to be approved and then put the approved minutes up. But however administratively you can best do it, you need to be very clear that what's up there is either draft or approved. That's the paramount thing. Okay? Thanks.
I have 2 meetings that I take minutes for that do that. And what I do is, actually mine say proposed. Does it make a difference if it's proposed or draft on it?
I think that's fine. It just needs to be clear that they're not the approved or the final minutes.
What I have in the header is proposed minutes for, and then when it's approved, adopted or minutes for adopted on, and take the watermark off.
That's fine.
When it's posted, it actually says in the post that it's a draft. So I like to think that it's very, very clear that when you pull it up, you are looking at a draft stat, and it's going to have errors in it until it's approved. That's how I do it.
So folks have different practices, of course, on how they take minutes. If you find that your board or committee is frequently changing or amending minutes, then you probably don't want to put the drafts up. Okay? If it tends to be, maybe you might change a typo or something, then you can certainly put the drafts up, but make sure that it's very clear that it's not the final version.
Those 2 boards just have a lot of interest, and people want to see what was done.
Well, and that goes to
very quickly.
And that goes to the question we talked about earlier about requiring meetings to be recorded in some fashion so that they're accessible for folks either after the fact or I don't know if you do any live streaming of meetings, but probably Board of Selectmen, right? because folks want to know what's going on, right? And so the more you make available to them, again, the more transparent government is. So meeting content. I told you a little earlier that I would tell you exactly what needs to be in your meeting notice. I've cited the statute there. You have to have date, time, and place of the meeting. Okay? Obviously the board or commission name. And we do like you to put in addresses, right? It's become very shorthand in a lot of places not to put the address because everybody knows where town hall is, right? Or the community center. We do encourage you to actually put the address in your meeting postings. There are some times when you're not having the meeting in exactly the same place every time. So that's another reason why you want to be clear each and every time where the meeting is going to be. Here's one of the changes, right, with the open meeting law 2010. The meeting notice needs to contain a list of topics the chair reasonably anticipates being discussed. Okay? So everything that the chair thinks is going to be discussed at a meeting at least 48 hours in advance, not counting Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays, needs to be on your meeting notice. I'll talk a little later about the fact it doesn't mean that nothing new could be discussed from what's on the meeting agenda, but there are some parameters around that. And the topics, as I said earlier, has to have enough specificity so that to reasonably advise the public what you're going to talk about. Okay. Again, the Attorney General, who has oversight now over the open meeting law and who does respond to open meeting law complaints, they issue a number of decisions. Now in 5 years, we've got a whole lot of those decisions to draw upon for their interpretation of the open meeting law. They say that a topic is this is on your meeting notice now, not in your meeting minutes, but the topic has enough specificity if someone out in the public can read it and know exactly what you're going to be talking about. Where do you post your meeting minutes? Excuse me, your meeting notices? Okay. Do you do it online too? So technically, even though most communities, it's always traditionally been a town clerk function, be aware that it is the public body's responsibility, and the chair more specifically, to ensure that meeting notices are posted. Okay? So it's not going to be an okay excuse to say, oh, the town clerk didn't post it, only gave 46 hours notice rather than the 48. That's not going to be an excuse that would allow the body to go ahead with the meeting, even though the notice wasn't posted. That may or may not have any impact on you folks, right? Different towns have different procedures on how they handle these things. It is common for it to go through the town clerk, but folks need to be aware it's not the clerk's responsibility under the law to make sure that your meeting notices are for each individual body are posted. It's the body's responsibility to ensure that they're posted properly. When we get to this idea of what's enough detail in a notice so that the public knows what's going on, you should write things out that we might commonly referred to as through initials or otherwise. I had an open meeting law complaint recently where the individual complained that the meeting notice said FAA instead of Federal Aviation Administration on the meeting notice. Now, we haven't quite gotten a decision yet from the Attorney General on that, but in other instances, they have advised, for example, spell out HUD, spell out CPA, spell out, we're used to using a lot of shorthand, especially there might be lingo that's particular to each board or body. And when you're doing your meeting notice, think about spelling things out. The AG has said that is recommended. Executive sessions. For those of you that do have executive sessions on your bodies do go into executive session, okay? You need to include either the statutory site or the full text of the exemption, right? So the card I gave you, or the executive session checklist I gave you, has all the different reasons why a body could go into executive session, and there's your statutory references. So, for example, if we're going to go in to talk about a pending piece of litigation and we're going to be discussing litigation strategy, the agenda would either say executive session pursuant to general law, chapter 30A, section 21A, parens 3, or it might recite the text of that section, or it might include both. Okay.
Michelle, I just want to say too, when we do our executive session minutes for the Board of Selectmen, we always say exemption 6, to consider the purchase, exchange, lease value, and then we literally put that whole section on there for exemption number 6. And then we add the specific address or topic or something like that so people can understand what it is. But I use this executive session every single time I post for executive session to make sure that I got the language exactly right. I write which number exemption we use, and I define everything.
So this is an incredibly hot topic right now, and Erica commented that when they do their executive session agendas, their meeting notices, as well as their minutes, they use that checklist to recite the language. I will tell you that the use of the word exemption has been challenged by an individual. I have an open meeting law complaint pending right now, which has not yet been decided, where the gentleman has complained that we say exemption 6, but the word exemption is not in the statute. Everyone knows that we're talking about purpose number 6 or General Law Chapter 38, Section 21A, paren 6. But there is, the safest thing always is parroting the language or giving that exact statutory site. I will tell you that I've argued to the AG, and this issue is still pending, that everyone knows it's an exemption. It's an exemption to the requirement that you're having it in open. So just be aware that this is the level of detail that folks are going into the weeds in terms of scrutinizing meeting notices, meeting minutes, to determine, whether or not they think there's a basis for an open meeting law complaint. Yes?
2 questions for you. The town right now uses the town clerk to post a meeting. They also do it on their website. So now there's 2 specific places that they can go to. Does one have precedent over the other? Because I'm thinking, let's say the town clerk fails to post the notice. They post it at a later time than the 48 hours. But the other one on the town website is posted correctly. Does one have preference over the other?
I'm going to give you, the question is, does one location of posting have preference or priority over the other, i.e. the physical posting that the town clerk does versus the town website? I'm going to give you my lawyer answer. It depends. Website posting can be an alternative to physical posting, but if that's going to happen, that's a determination that needs to be made sort of at an administration level, and the Attorney General has to be notified that that's going to be your primary method of posting. If that hasn't occurred, then the physical posting is the primary posting.
We said that the website is secondary.
And again, that's the determination. So website, in the absence of, as I said, in the absence of an administrative across-the-board determination that website's going to be the primary, and there's, with that, the notification to the Attorney General, then the physical posting is the primary.
All right, so that kind of clarifies that. It should be a town policy decision that's approved by the AG's office, is what you're saying.
There's a notification to the AG.
So the second question I have for you, which tends to be a little bit of a hot topic, is when can boards meet? There's some controversy that surrounds the Saturday principle of a public board meeting on Saturday. And we've gone as far as to do a town meeting on Saturday. So are Saturdays taboo, or are we strictly Monday through Friday business? Help me to understand that.
So the question, when can a board meet? Are there any prohibitions in terms of meeting on weekends, for example? No, except, first off, town meeting is not covered by the open meeting law. So that's, town meeting is just separate, okay? You can't, there are certain boards that can't meet on an election day. And you probably shouldn't meet on an election day anyway, because, from a practical perspective, people are going out to vote, and are they going to get to a meeting, or be able to get to a meeting as well? With respect to Saturdays, it's okay to meet on a Saturday. The AG, might suggest that it's probably better to meet, sort of on a regular schedule where people know and it's work hours type of thing, or Monday through Friday hours. But there's no prohibition. I don't generally recommend meeting on Sundays. Again, but it's not, It's not statutory as long as you've provided the requisite notice and importantly, that your meeting is in an accessible location. Okay, you're not meeting in somebody's house. And if you are meeting off hours, is the building open? Have you made proper arrangements to ensure that someone is not going to find themselves locked out because the custodial staff wasn't there to open the doors or something along those lines? Okay?
And that's one of the reasons why we try to hold most of the meetings in this building, because it's open 24/7.
And so Erica's comment was this facility being part of the police station is open 24/7, and so it is accessible, would meet those accessibility requirements. Okay.
Just a posting question. In the tree advisory world, in addition to the agenda that gets posted now, if there's going to be a discussion about individual trees, they put, from time to time, or they put posting on the trees, but they have trouble staying up. People will tear them down, or whether they will take them off. Does that, if a posting can't stay on a tree for whatever reason, does that create a problem for that?
So the question had to do with when we're dealing with trees and posting of notices on trees, not under the open meeting law. But I don't know whether or not under the statutes that are specific to trees, whether there's a requirement that you need to post on the tree. So that would need to be something that, I know there's an MGL that deals with sort of removal of trees. I just, at the top of my head, I don't know what it says. So that's a separate issue from the open meeting law. Okay?
In your presentation today, are you going to cover sort of what sort of activity constitutes a meeting that needs to be noticed, i.e., how many people together constitute a meeting that needs to be noticed, or telephone activity amongst how many people constitutes a meeting to be noticed? That part of your presentation.
Okay, so the question was, are we going to talk about what is a meeting? The answer is no, but I'll tell you right now. Okay? The definition of a meeting is very broad. All right? If you have a quorum of the body and they're talking about something under the subject matter jurisdiction of the body, that's a meeting. Some folks will say to me, oh, but we didn't deliberate. We didn't vote. Right? The AG is very strict on this. Email communications, telephone communications, right? Any of those things, texting. Now we've got this whole issue of Facebook postings or social media postings where, you know, if a quorum of a body is posting on a single page, on a single topic, have we now violated the open meeting law? Okay? It's a real problem.
Is quorum defined as a majority of the commissioners?
Yes, yes. Now, recognize that in some bodies may have different requirements to act. Like some land use bodies may need a supermajority to act, but a quorum is generally a simple majority.
So if there's a committee of 9, and if there's a gathering of less than 5 people, that doesn't necessarily constitute a meeting?
So technically, you are correct. But we are very nervous about that. We don't like that at all. And the AG would advise you to be very careful about that. And the reason why is it is so easy for someone to see 4 people of a 9-member body sitting somewhere having coffee talking about something and make the jump that something inappropriate, and I don't mean, I mean inappropriate in the terms of the open meeting law, right, is going on, that there's some discussion that ought to be done in a meeting, and it's not being done in a meeting. And then the issue becomes, so say those 4 people talk, and one of them goes to a 5th member and says, oh, by the way, we've been kicking this around. Well, now you've really violated the open meeting law. Serial communications of any form, once they get to a quorum of the body, will violate the open meeting law. So we just don't think it's a good idea. Now, we are sort of digressing a little bit. There is exemptions for certain things like site visits. If your body does site visits, but make sure you're not deliberating over anything. Social events, going to the retirement party, going to the groundbreaking ceremony, typically those wouldn't be, but make sure you're not talking about anything you shouldn't, right? Educational programs like this one, if I had a quorum of a body, they could come here without posting a meeting. One of my boards is giving me a real hard time because they don't like that answer. And they say, well, I've been told that since it's less than a quorum, well, that's true, right? But it just, we've seen so many, not necessarily some open meeting law complaints, but also just more criticisms from the outside, whether it be from taxpayers, other folks in town, and the assumption is something untoward, or you're trying to hide something by having these discussions outside of a regular meeting. I had this guy back here first.
So here's another point that comes up. You have elected and appointed officials who seem to feel that they should be able to freely engage in social media because they're now private citizens. And this private citizen versus their role as elected and appointed officials, especially when it comes to social media, is proving to be, I don't know what your take is on it as a lawyer or defending it.
Oh, I have a take.
Okay, so, yeah, because I'd love to hear it at this point.
So,
It's getting cloudy out there.
so the question has to do with participation by board and committee members on social media. A little bit beyond the topic. I think social media is the downfall of local government. That's my take, and I will be happy to go on record to say it. I had to be persuaded that there was a legitimate reason for government to engage in social media. And when I was convinced with the folks in Springfield, when they had the hurricanes, right, they had, or was it a tornado? I forget, a couple of years ago, right? It swept through downtown. It was a tornado. Because they had established a social media presence, whether it be through Facebook followers or Twitter feeds, they were able to communicate information with folks that you wouldn't necessarily be able to on an RSS feed or something else on your town website. Because as long as your phone's charged, a lot of people these days have smartphones and are able to access that type of information. That, if the power's out, can't turn on my computer, maybe I'm getting my phone, I don't know. But so I was convinced at that point, said, okay, I can see a legitimate reason. But I want folks to be very mindful before they engage in social media, why they're doing it, the parameters around why they're doing it. And when we do social media policies for towns, we make it clear, you've got to remember open meeting law and public records. It's a huge problem for us. I had a public records request the other day for everything the town planner had posted on Facebook. On other people's, not my Facebook, not my town Facebook page, other Facebook pages. And what do I do with that? The postings were about a potential project. So it wasn't like posting about the weather or posting about a social event. So there was an argument, and I think a fair argument, that person might have been posting in an official capacity. At least it appeared to the public as such. And so you're required to maintain that. If you have if your department or the town, Facebook, Twitter, you got to be saving all that stuff. And in that sort of fluid electronic environment, how does that happen? It's really a huge challenge. But, Facebook and talking about social media is I could do a whole session on it, quite frankly. It's a little bit beyond. Is that a follow-up?
I'd probably strongly encourage it because I would love you to, personally, I'd love you to do it. Because it seems...
I won't make friends.
I wouldn't expect you to make friends, but I do believe that we need to do the right things now. And it is becoming a real challenging area to start dealing with.
And again, I advise, and what happens a lot, quite frankly, is the police department sets up a Facebook page, and maybe the building department, or departments start to set them up, and then I get the question, so what do we do with this, right? And I much prefer that folks have that at that administration level discussion before any department engages in social media. You have that discussion. Because there's some very technical issues, right? On your Facebook page, there's government pages versus regular pages. They have different terms of privacy. You need all sorts of disclaimers. These are all types of things. And again, a bit beyond the topic for our discussion, but to the extent that you need to be mindful when you're engaging in participation in social media, there is the possibility that if you have board members or committee members or even staff posting on social media about issues that may come under the board's jurisdiction, that in and of itself may have an issue with the open meeting law. I'll get you next.
If you're going to require
Yes. You don't have a quorum, you can't do anything. Town meeting's different, by the way. Okay.
Since the question came up as to what constitutes a meeting forum, if a email goes out and it's looking for responses, but it's sent out in a group message to an entire committee, but you respond individually and to one person, does that constitute a forum, and does it go against the open meeting law?
So email is such a challenge. You all see, right, they sent out the email, please do not reply to all, right? Technically, as you've described it, it may not be an open meeting law violation, okay? Depending on who that person is. If it's, so there's email is fine for scheduling, right? For distributing information that is to be discussed at a meeting without generating discussion, okay? But that's pretty much it. Anything beyond that, if one, let's say in your example, one person sends something out to the rest of the board. Here's a citizen complaint that came in, and it will be on the agenda for next week. If one person responds and says, oh, we really need to address this, they have now just weighed in substantively, given their opinion on the issue, and that may be considered an open meeting law violation. So we highly encourage folks to be very careful about what they do in terms of email. If all the comments in your example, and the example was if we just, an email goes out and says respond to a single person as opposed to the body as a whole or a quorum of the body, is that an open meeting law violation? If it's a staff person, that's probably okay, right? If it's the chair or another member of the body, that's not okay, because each person individually responding to the chair, now the chair has more than a quorum of information, right? So you just need to be really careful. And text messaging has become a huge thing. Instant messaging, you know, folks are using that now for communication, and we are getting asked to produce that stuff, and I can't usually produce that stuff because it's not, every phone carrier is different in terms of what is saved and what can be retrieved. But I do find that a lot of my staff, a lot of my cops are using text messaging as a way to communicate with other officers or staff, and that can create a problem for us from the public records perspective. No?
What about members of the public calling individuals on board? Members of a public or a public interest group that might call somebody on the board and say, we've got real concerns about this stuff, or something like that.
So the question has to do with how does this all apply to contacts from non-members of the public body? That's okay, right? They can call, the open meeting law doesn't restrict private citizens, but what do you do with that information? So the chair gets a call from 3 residents on a particular street complaining about something that's going on. If the chair then communicates to the entire board or a quorum of the board, I've received this complaint, what do you think we should do? That's a big no-no. Okay? It may be that it's, depending on the nature of the complaint, maybe we might have a basis to talk about it in executive session versus open, but either way, that's something that ought to be put on an agenda and or if there's going to be any discussion, right? I'm not trying to tell a board that you need to respond to every contact that you get from the public, but if it's an issue that you think ought to be discussed by the board, then it needs to be on a meeting agenda somewhere and discussed in the context of a meeting.
Conversely, what about a member of a commission contacting a person about something that's on the agenda?
A member of the public?
Yeah.
So again, that type of communication isn't prohibited. It's what you do with the information afterwards that is the issue. I have a lot of folks that engage in sort of their own kind of fact-finding, whether it's at the sanction of the board or on their own accord. They're going out, they're trying to figure out what this project or issue is about, right? Well, how do you share that information? Do you disclose that? I mean, in most instances, I say that if that's going to be something that influences a decision, even that individual person's decision on a particular matter, it ought to be disclosed during a meeting. You know, I went to the site and I looked at this, or I did this, or I did that. And, you know, depending on what you're acting on, certain licenses, certain permits or applications, you may have some limits on what you're supposed to consider, especially if you're doing public hearings, right? You know, you're supposed to base your decisions on what information comes into you at the public hearing. So if there's some information that an individual has gathered and it's not shared in the context of the public hearing, but it provides the basis for a decision, that may be problematic. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm thinking of something specific.
Yeah, let's not. Well, and remember, we're on video, so we're not going to talk about this specific. But you know, I think.
There's going to be Q&A afterwards too, so if you've got specific questions later that you don't want.
Yeah, I'll be here to answer those questions. Okay. All right. So I mentioned to you, when you have executive sessions, right? Cite the statute, cite the text, or both. Shorthand. So many folks across the state use shorthand references when they go into executive session. I have one town that will constantly say, executive session to discuss personnel matters. There is no such thing under the open meeting law. And yet, 5 years after trying to tell them to change it, they won't change it. All these shorthands that we have developed for describing open executive session reasons, let's get rid of them, okay? Because they're not always correct. You're better off, as I've said earlier, just citing either the section or the whole language. And I think Erica indicated that that's the preference, is to do the whole language of the statute. All right. I said this is a pop quiz, but it's really a poll. How many of you folks have meeting notices that say old business, new business? What do you say under old business, new business?
So we don't have old business, but we do have a new business category, and it has a little asterisk. And then on the second page, it says for items not reasonably anticipated within 48 hours of posting.
And so Erica commented that for their new business agenda item, meeting notice item, and I will, if it wasn't clear, I use meeting notice and agenda interchangeably because really, for all intents and purposes, they're now one and the same. Under a new business, put a little asterisk. 4 topics that the chair didn't reasonably anticipate at least 48 hours in advance might be discussed. The AG says that's okay. Okay? I'm going to talk a little bit more about old business, new business in a minute. What's an emergency? When can you have a meeting with less than 48 hours notice? Sinkholes. Water main breaks. Okay? I'm going to talk more about that. But we just found out we need to. Well, the answer to when we talked about old business, new business, kind of answers this one, right? Topics that the chair didn't reasonably anticipate at least 48 hours in advance. Okay, there can be, so I'm going to talk more in depth about some of these, so if you could hold your question for a second. There can be times when you can talk about something that's not on a meeting agenda. For folks that do executive sessions, right? Time, date, place of the meeting on your meeting notice. Executive session pursuant to General Law, Chapter 38, Section 21A, parens whatever. Is that enough on a meeting notice? I'll tell you why that isn't enough on a meeting notice. Okay. When the open meeting law changed, there was a lot of discussion about this new business, old business. Many, if not most, boards and commissions would have this new business, old business type of denotation on their agenda to cover stuff that that just came up that they wanted to talk about. The Attorney General says it's okay if under new business, you actually itemize things you're going to talk about. And that makes sense, right? And under old business, if you make this indication, as Erica indicated earlier, that this old business, I've switched them. Old business, you itemize what you're talking about. New business, you are clear that that is only intended to capture those topics that the chair didn't reasonably anticipate at least 48 hours before the meeting. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about what you do when you think you're going to have something new come up that isn't on the meeting agenda. In the back.
So you have an item that you have reasonably thought of before the 40 hours, but you haven't discussed it in the meeting yet. And it's new business because you haven't discussed it. I don't understand. This thing you're going to talk about at that meeting, they're new because they are new. But you anticipated them beforehand, they just weren't discussed at the meeting yet.
So my point with the old business, new business is that was a nomenclature that a lot of boards and committees had used as kind of a catch-all to allow them to discuss items that weren't necessarily on an agenda. Because in the old days, right, the meeting notice didn't need to contain the level of detail that it needs to contain now. And so when we look at folks, as they try to adapt to the new open meeting law, there's a lot of practices that get carried over. And one of those practices that has gotten carried over is this notion of old business, new business. And folks have challenged in a number of different ways whether that's sufficient detail on a meeting notice. If you use it, you may choose not to use old business, new business. But and the AG will say, as long as if you're going to use the old business or even a new business, right? You've got to give the enough specificity as to what it is you're talking about. And then if you want to maintain this sort of catch-all placeholder for new business, by which you mean items that we didn't expect we were going to talk about tonight in enough time to put it on the, in detail, if that's what you're using the new business placeholder for, you need to put a clarification that that's the intent for it.
So I'm the chairman of the Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board. When I make up the agenda under new business, I list in detail all the new business items. I don't just say new business.
And that's fine. And that's fine.
And I do the same for old business, but down below old business, I'll specify why this is old business, why we're talking about this again, saying that there's more discussion on this, or this person's going to come and talk about that. So
And that's more detail than you probably need, but that's great. Because someone can pick it up and go, this is the continuation of a discussion that occurred. My only point was when you use, again, the holdover from, what I'm calling the old days, anything before July 1st, 2010, there was this practice to use these placeholders as a way to say, well, we're going to basically to leave it open for the body to discuss whatever they felt like discussing. And with the requirement now that your agenda has to have more detail, the qualification is you just can't use that new business placeholder to discuss anything you want. Erica.
And Peter, I just want to clarify too that at the Board of Selectmen level, we try to put every single topic that we know is coming up on the agenda. And say, we post our meetings on Friday, the meetings on Wednesday, and we know Monday something new came up, I'll amend that agenda so that it'll be on the new agenda. But if something came up the morning of the meeting and I don't have time to amend it, that's where we'll discuss it under that new business. And the chair will say that we have one new business item tonight that came up today. We didn't anticipate it. We're going to discuss it briefly.
And so Erica was commenting on what the Board of Selectmen policy is. I'm actually going to talk about that in a little more detail, some of the things that Erica raised. Sure.
I have a couple of board members who just bring things up. I tell them not to. They just bring things up in the meeting and say they want to talk about stuff. And I've had to tell them you cannot talk about it because it's not on the agenda, if that's correct, right? You can't just, because if it's not on the agenda, then the people who might want to talk about it aren't there because they didn't know about it. Then things are going to get, you know what I'm saying?
So I'm perfectly comfortable with you telling folks that they can't. The law does give you a little wiggle room, and it's hard for you as chair to always know what random people are going to bring up. The AG would tell you don't take any action on that item until it can be posted on a regular meeting notice. So, if there's going to be any discussion, because the same thing happens with people in the audience. If you folks have a public comment section of your meeting, which tends to be more like the Board of Selectmen and not necessarily the other boards. But, if someone comes up and says, I want to talk about this, well, you can't say to them, you can't bring it up, but what the board does with it is the issue. And we would always tell you to not take any action until it could be on a proper meeting.
We can talk about it, but we will put it on the agenda for the next meeting if we're going to have a vote.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's what I was going to suggest to Peter. Because we've had it happen too. At the last minute, somebody comes and says, this is what we should talk about. We say, good idea. We'll put it on the agenda.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great way to do it. Okay. You have a question? Sure.
Separate question. It's the conflict between General Robert and the open meeting law. We would sort out continuing, also called old business, and put that first, and then new business, even if it's adequately described, and put it second. In the event that we run out of time and somebody moves adjournment, that we have sorted our process so that the continuing items go first. But that's not a consideration in the open meeting.
And the question had to do with the order of items on the agenda. That's utterly up to you folks. Okay? The open meeting law doesn't tell you how you consider things. All right? You don't need to put times for specific items. Especially in the permitting context, if you have multiple applications, as a courtesy to the applicant, some boards might put times for individual items on the agenda. That's not required under the open meeting law.
This may be redundant for some, but I just want to get some clarity on if there is a new business item that just came up that morning, it does need to go to the chair. Is that correct?
So the question had to do with if something new comes up, does it have to go through the chairman before it can be discussed at a meeting? I think that's more of an issue of protocol for each board. I have a wide variety of practices among boards about to what extent individual members of a body are allowed to raise, to get things put on the agenda. The administrative responsibility of preparing the agenda, the topics the chair reasonably anticipates 48 hours in advance, that does put a lot of responsibility and a lot of authority in the chair, but it doesn't limit other members of boards from saying, I want this on the agenda. So if a chair is not going to do that, there's nothing to preclude the board member from bringing it up at a meeting and saying, I want the board to discuss this. Whether or not it's appropriate to discuss at that meeting or get put on another agenda is a different topic. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm not sure how the saying goes, but sort of along the lines of poor planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part, right? So emergency meetings can be held with less than 48 hours notice, but emergencies are acts of God generally. The fact that town meeting is happening tonight and we forgot to vote on something that we need to make a recommendation to town meeting on is not an emergency, okay? That's really all I need to say about emergencies. Anybody have any questions? Water main breaks, those sort of public safety disasters, those are the types of emergencies where less than 48 hours notice can be given. The AG would tell you, though, that if you meet in an emergency session, obviously all the minute-taking requirements have to be observed, and then at your next regular meeting, you basically recount what happened at the emergency meeting, okay?
And do you have to reaffirm if you took any votes, like kind of just reaffirm them at the next
So Erica asked, do you have to reaffirm or ratify any votes taken at that emergency meeting? We recommend that. It's the idea being you recount what you did at the meeting, and you've properly posted it now, and you're telling folks, we had an emergency. This is why it was an emergency. This is why we couldn't have 48 hours notice, and what we did then, we're going to do it again, just to be on the safe side, okay? The AG would also recommend that you post as soon as you can. Even if it's an hour before the meeting, you still try to post with whatever amount of notice you can for an emergency. So we just find out, tonight's our meeting, and we just found out that we've been sued. We just got served with a complaint. Can we talk about it at tonight's meeting? Yes, this would be a situation where the chair didn't reasonably anticipate 48 hours in advance that this was going to come up, but this is a topic that we need to have some discussion on. As I said before, the AG does recommend that to the extent that you can, you not take action on something until it can be posted properly and the subject of a regularly scheduled or even a specially scheduled meeting, but one with 48 hours advance notice. But you can consider topics. The AG also recommends that you update your meeting postings, right? Again, same, with emergencies. As soon as you know, update your meeting notice. Also, if you've posted your agenda and you realize that it's might be confusing or it might not have enough detail, you can amend, right? To add some more detail, to make sure you can't necessarily completely change your agenda, but think about communicating as best as you can with the public, right? Getting them whatever information you can give them, updating, and that may be, the website updating, even posting amended meeting notices, whether at the town clerk or at the site of the meeting, right? Any questions on that? Okay, and I've just given you a comment from the Attorney General on when you can talk about certain topics that weren't on the meeting notice. So, going back to my question I had before, if you do executive sessions and you have your meeting notice, time, date, place of the meeting, executive session pursuant to Exemption 6, and that's the only thing that's on your agenda, the Attorney General would say that's not enough. And the reason why, you're supposed to start your meetings always in the open. Did I say that? All meetings have to start in the open. And so if there's no other agenda items on your notice, then does the public actually understand that you are going to open in open session and then vote to go into executive session? If you put the Pledge of Allegiance, that signifies you're doing that in open. If you put convene, if you put open session, something on your meeting notice to signify that there is an open session prior to executive session, then that's going to be okay. But I've had many boards up until recently, right? Because we've just started to get open meeting law complaints in this regard. We all thought it was kind of self-evident. Everybody knows they have to open the meeting first in open session and then vote to go into executive session. But the AG has said no. It has to be very clear to the public when the only item or items on your agenda are executive session, that the board will be opening and open first. I don't know if there's a preferred method of doing it, whether, I might say, convene, or I might say convene in open session as the first agenda item before the executive session. But I have had ones where it said Pledge of Allegiance. Well, that should signify. I don't prefer that as the way to signify that you're going to start an open. I prefer to say something like convene and open. But if there's other agenda items that are open session, the AG has said, well, the public was notified that there was going to be an open meeting by all these other agenda items. But I've been telling everyone, you know what, just put on the top, convene an open session, and that'll save you. Okay, so I'm moving to meeting minutes. Does anybody have any questions about meeting notice before I move to the meeting minutes? Okay, so both executive and open session meetings, you have to keep minutes. The law now tells you what your minutes need to say, right? Date, time, location. Who was there? Who was absent of the public body? It is common to also include any administrative staff people. If I'm there, they put my name in. Although you're not likely in a public hearing context going to be able to record, nor do we tell you have to record every single person that's in the room, but the members of the public body who was there, who was absent, and then it's usually common to, someone from town manager's office or your staff person or the building inspector, somebody's present. Oftentimes that is noted in the meeting minutes. The discussions on each subject, I usually use the agenda as a good template, right? Item 1 was application for a liquor license permit at the Salty Dog or whatever it is, and there's the discussion, all right? a list of the documents used at the meeting. This is the one area where I see most boards falling down right now in terms of compliance with the new open meeting law, is including in your meeting minutes an indication of the documents used at the meeting. I'm going to talk about what it means to be used at the meeting. It does not mean that your minutes have to recite every single document that was in the packet that the board members got in advance of the meeting, okay? And the documents themselves do not have to be appended to the minutes, but they are considered to be part of the record of the meeting.
Okay, so this goes back to members present or absent. Is it important to put what time a committee member entered the meeting?
So the question had to do with if folks arrive at the meeting late, do you put that in the minutes? I think it's a good idea. It's particularly an issue if we're talking about a land use permitting, right? You're going to really need to be careful about that. I mean, I have had situations where I've had board members come in what I consider to be too late to be able to properly vote on something, you know, because they're required to, unless, have you folks adopted Mullen Rule here? Okay. So maybe there's some more flexibility with the Mullen Rule for a person who arrives late to be able to go and then watch the tape of what they missed. But, you know, if someone's 2 minutes late, I probably wouldn't necessarily note that. If they're, I don't know. What do you say in terms of about how late?
In our situation, like if somebody's not there at the beginning of the meeting, in our top paragraph where I say the meeting, you know, that's who was present, who was absent, I'll note them as being absent. And then any votes that were taken, while there was less than, you know, a full board, I'll note that, you know, so voted 4-0 instead of a 5-0 board. And then I'll say at 5:42, Terry Norton join the meeting. And then I'll start saying all in favor, so voted, so that it's also very clear to whoever's reading the minutes that we didn't have a full board present. We had a quorum, but not a full board during some of the sections. And then this is when this person arrived and they started participating in the rest of the meeting.
So Erica noted what the selectmen's practice is in terms of indicating when someone was absent at the beginning. I would always note in the minutes when someone joined the meeting. Whether or not I actually put the time down is probably going to depend on, you know, what I'm doing. Is it a regular meeting? Is it a public hearing where that's going to be relevant for purposes of figuring out whether Mullen Rule applies or something along those lines? But I would always, if a board member comes in and I'm in the point in the meeting when they come in my minutes, I would indicate that they then join the meeting.
Now, we were
Okay.
always told, too, that if somebody left the meeting, like even if they went for a bathroom break, I note that in the minutes. You know, at 5:42, Mr. DeCosta left the meeting at 6 o'clock, he rejoined the meeting. So people know that for a section of that meeting, he wasn't present. Is that
So,
required?
Erica commented that the practice for the Board of Selectmen is whenever people go to take a bathroom break or step outside to make a phone call, that she makes the notation in the minutes that so-and-so left and so-and-so returned. I can't say to you that I know of an AG determination on that. Better to be safe than sorry. There's no reason why not to do that if you can, right? Because remember, one thing I'll tell you a little later, you'll see in a slide, meeting minutes are required to be maintained forever, right? And they are the record of what happened. And when when I as the lawyer get a piece of litigation and I have to go back to 1982 and figure out what action was taken, I love minutes that are more detailed, generally. Unless you really screwed up, in which case I don't know that I want the meeting minutes to tell me that. But so my point is that these are the permanent records and the official record of what went on in a meeting until such time as, you know, the laws catch up with technology and say to us, well, a video or audio recording is now going to be the official record, which I don't know that that's going to happen in my lifetime. But the minutes, the written minutes, are the official record. So, you know, if you can make them as user-friendly as possible, then the lawyer certainly appreciates that. And, you know, folks on the outside will appreciate that as well.
Really quickly, Michelle, and this is to Erica. The way that you do
Okay, so the question had to do with, is it, as I'm understanding it, is it really part of Board of Selectmen policy that all boards should or ought to, in their meeting minutes, record even, when folks step out of the meeting for a minute?
Well, not so much that part,
No.
the part where it shows a person is absent, and then they come in, if our meeting starts at 3:15.
We would highly recommend it.
I think to go back to what the statute says, we're supposed to indicate members present or absent. And I read that as members present and absent, right? I don't read it as an or. One could assume that if you've got 5 and you've listed 3, those are the only 3 that are there. But again, coming from with my hat of looking at minutes historically, I want the names. I want to know. And the other thing too, by the way, this is my personal preference, put people's full names, right? I see many minutes where it'll just say Sue C., C being the first initial of their last name, because everybody knows who the Board of Selectmen is, or everybody knows who the members of this body are. But I don't know, and a member of the public might not necessarily know.
And in our
So.
opening paragraph, we always list their full names, Bob DeCosta, Rick Atherton, Matt Keith were present, Tobias Glidden, Don Hill, Holgate were absent. And then as we continue on, Chairman DeCosta, Mr. Fee, however,
And
not Bobby and Matt, because it gets very confusing.
So I'll tell you that the nomenclature is not something that I've seen the AG address. It's definitely preferred, but I do have boards that will say Tom D. and just do it that way. But to sort of go back to the other issue, part of your requirement is to record members present and absent. So if folks leave and come back, there is, I think you record that. Where you make the judgment of whether somebody leaves for 2 seconds to go to the potty, is that really a situation where you'd record it? Maybe you want to do that. Or maybe you want to start doing that. Question back there.
All right. Thank you for doing this. This is incredible.
Okay, so did everyone hear? He said this minute-taking training is incredible.
This is pretty good. It's like we're going from 1950 to 2015 back and forth. But I want to add something to this, unless you were going to say it already. Boards with alternates and activating an alternate. In the planning board, we do a pretty good job with that because the public doesn't know what that is. In a lot of cases, if you have, when you brought up the Mullen rule, it made me think of all this stuff. I wasn't thinking about that until you mentioned it. Where an alternate gets activated by the chair, we list it that way because if an alternate's name is in the minutes, but they're not a full member, the public might not understand who even the person is, let alone if he participated. So I think that that's important as well to add into this discussion, because some boards have alternates that are regulatory and some don't.
So the comment had to do with indicating when you have a board that has alternates, indicating in what capacity they're actually attending the meeting. And that's a really good point, and I wasn't going to cover it. I understand that there is this common practice with the Conservation Commission, which technically does not have, if I remember correctly, they don't have the legal ability to have alternates unless there's some sort of special act or maybe even a charter or bylaw provision that allows it. But to have this practice of having alternates who sit in all the meetings so that they know what's going on, and so at some point they might get elevated to be a full member, right? But other than that, planning board and zoning board, I think they legally can have alternates. And so it is very important to know in those contexts in what capacity an alternate is being present, because an alternate may actually be sitting on the board for a particular permit decision because a regular member is unable to for whatever reason. So, that's a great point. Records should be very clear on that, especially because then when it comes time to record the vote, it needs to be clear that person was there in a capacity that they could vote on the matter. Yes.
Really, I think ZBA, and I think minutes for ZBA and HDC, I actually will list the alternates present separately so that if a regular member goes off and everyone can go back and historically see that all the way through the hearings, this alternate has been at every hearing and can now step up to replace whoever is missing, and then have 5 on the board again. It's just sort of the way I do it for that group.
So the comment had to do with reflecting alternates sort of separately, but showing that they attended the meetings. And absolutely, if alternates are there, you should reflect that they're there. I'm not going to comment on in what circumstances is appropriate for an alternate to step into the shoes of a regular member, because I think it varies depending on the process and which board you're talking about and what kind of application you're talking about. Okay.
Just a quick share on time, because our committee is relatively small. The issue of quorum arises, and so I note times of arrival and departure if they're different from meeting start and meeting adjournment, and then make an assessment as to whether or not we had a quorum. Typically, we do have a quorum, but I say so.
So the comment was, particularly with small boards, noting presence and absences as it happens throughout the meeting because it may impact quorum. Of course, if you lose a quorum in the meeting, it's supposed to stop. So
But
that's
if the person's coming back, you might just
and that makes a lot of sense then to sort of clarify that you hadn't you might be better recessing for 5 minutes depending on the situation, depending on what you're talking about. I mean, I have so many boards that nobody ever attends a meeting, nobody watches a meeting, nobody cares. Not that we all don't care for your service, but nobody from the outside is looking in. And so in those circumstances, there can be a lot of laxness in how we handle meetings. And so you need to sort of make some of your own judgments about what it is you're working on. Is it significant enough that there may be a possibility that's going to be an issue? Quorum will be challenged, and I may want to recess.
Now, I have a separate question on names and recording of names. I record the full name. I avoid honorifics because it's so easy to get them wrong. We've got a very prestigious population on Nantucket, and if I miss a doctor or a professor or an esquire, I've offended somebody. So I just say, this is Lee Saperstein.
And the comment was, in that, and with this particular board, they don't include honorifics because it can be hard to get it right. Trust me, I've got a board member that constantly tells me, I'm Dr. so-and-so. Okay, sorry. I appreciate that. I think it really, I think where we see titles used most frequently is when we're talking about the chairman of the board, the vice chair, the town manager, something like that. But there's no requirement in the open meeting law that you use titles at all. Okay.
Going to the list of documents, will you be getting?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Okay.
And I'm going to keep moving because that's a hot topic. Open session, right? No such thing as a secret ballot in open session. Votes in open session need only be recorded as like a 3-2.
Record means the number.
Yes.
Record is not synonymous with roll call.
So executive session, you must do roll call. There is no reason why, if you prefer, and you've always done roll call in open session, you can record it that way. You're not required to, unless, do you folks do remote participation? Have you authorized remote participation? I'm not going to really talk about remote participation a lot, but be aware that if someone is participating remotely at an open session, all votes has to be roll call in the minutes.
And we have a policy on that, and it's on our town website on the committees and boards page.
Okay, so as Erica noted, there's a policy on remote participation, and you should check it out on the website.
If a vote is, say, 3-2, does it matter whether or not you state who was opposed, who was for?
So again, for open session, you do not need to do that. I mean,
Can they request it? I have some boards, they want that.
that's
Want it
okay.
that way.
That's
We
okay.
do it at the Board of Selectmen, only because that's how we vote, but it just gives clarity.
It's okay. I mean, I have some boards that like that for political reasons because they want everybody to know who voted one way or another. And I have boards that want meeting minutes to be more detailed and to say that John C. said X, Y, and Z because they want everybody to know who took a position. It's not a requirement of open meeting law. Open session can just be a reflection of the actual vote. Executive session has to be roll call. Okay. So like the meeting notice, the meeting minutes should contain enough detail so that someone picking them up who didn't attend the meeting can read it and understand what you talked about and what you decided. We used to say, keep it really short with executive session meeting minutes. No longer. For those folks that do executive session, your meeting minutes need to be more detailed than they used to be. If your old executive session minutes used to say, we met on this date at this time, we talked about this case, and we adjourned. That's no longer going to be sufficient for executive session meeting minutes. Again, general rule, can someone pick it up, read it, understand what was discussed, and of course, see any action taken. Okay. Again, I said to you at the beginning, verbatim is not required, but some of the land use or permitting boards, you may want more detail because it may be relevant as a permit decision is appealed. Okay. I applauded the gentleman over there for saying that they get their minutes done in a week. The law says you have to have your minutes prepared and approved in a timely manner. It doesn't tell you what timely means. The AG prefers that you do it the next meeting. That may or may not be practical or realistic, but it's a great goal. I don't know, Erica, if there's an internal sort of town policy, but I will tell you that like 6 months is probably too late. Okay, so if anybody's really behind on their minutes, they need to get cracking. It's, again, the law says timely. AG says next meeting. What is timely probably falls somewhere in between the next meeting and 6 months down the road, right? Understandably, in the summertime, maybe you're not having as many meetings, or there's staff vacations, maybe, or board absences where you don't have a full board. Maybe those are circumstances that might justify a longer delay. But if you have a significant backlog of minutes, somebody's got to get cracking because you will get dinged for that. Okay.
Is that ultimately the chairman's responsibility? And, in other words, you have a situation where you have volunteers on a board, but the work is being prepared by staff, and then it creates this sort of conflict.
So unlike other provisions of the open meeting law, the responsibility to get the minutes approved, it doesn't say it's the chair's responsibility to do it, it's the whole board's responsibility. So if something's not getting done, I think it's legitimate for a board member to inquire, right? And I don't necessarily mean inquire directly to the staff, but inquire, as part of a meeting. It may be okay to inquire of staff, right? Every board has different dynamics, and their access to staff is going to be different. But if I'm a member of a board and I haven't seen minutes in 6 months, I'm going to ask the question, or I should ask the question, to find out sort of where we stand on it. And, of course, doing it in an open meeting means you've now put the issue out in the public, and, now people are aware. So if you're unable to, communicate that in a different channel. If you've got a 3-member board and you go to the chair and say, what's the story? I don't know, maybe you've just had a deliberation that violates the open meeting law. So it can be tricky. But yeah, I wouldn't just sit and assume that the chair will bring them forward in a timely manner.
It raises a question perhaps for Erica more than for you. But does the town monitor these?
So let me. So the question was whether there's a formal monitoring mechanism in place at the town level to ensure that folks do their minutes timely. But it sounds like you folks do them fairly timely. So it may not, maybe not across the board, but, folks seem to be attentive to the issue. And so maybe it hasn't been a problem. I have boards in towns that they look at me like I have 9 heads when I tell them they have to take minutes. And I tell them that they can't email each other all the time and make a decision on email, and that they can't meet in people's houses. And I don't think that's happening here. So it may be that there's not necessarily an issue. Ultimately, it's the body's responsibility. So they've got to keep on top of things.
This is specific to a specific board, but I have a situation where a member of the board has taken it upon herself to correct the minutes and then dictate that that's how it's supposed to be done. As I
So the question had to do with how can individual members of a board actually require changes? The minutes have to be approved by the board, either in open session or executive session, depending on what's appropriate in the circumstance. So typically, an individual member would need to bring changes to the full board for approval. A typo, I don't care. A typo, I'm not really going to make if I spelled the THEE, I don't consider that to be a very substantive issue. But if they're going to make any changes, it still has to be voted by the board. Okay, so documents used. Every single document that is provided to a board or committee member in advance of the meeting does not necessarily mean it's used. Okay? There's actually no definition in the law as to what it means for a document to be used. The Attorney General has indicated that for a document to be used, it needs to be physically present at the meeting. It needs to be verbally identified by a member of the body, and it has to be discussed by the body. Okay? I don't know what that means. All right? I mean, I think that there's always going to be some judgment that you have to exercise when trying to figure out if a document was used. There's a question, let's say the town manager has a document and the town manager refers to a document, but none of the board members actually discuss it. Maybe that's not used, because the town manager isn't part of the body. So, with the permitting folks, a lot of times you got plans, you got a lot of stuff. Okay, all I can tell you is it's a challenge, but you need to do it because that is where I'm seeing minutes fall down the most, is not including a listing. My recommendation is that you do it by topic, right? So you've had continuation of hearing on XYZ license, and you've done your summary, and you've indicated whether there's any votes, and then right after that, I'd indicate the documents used at that session. If applicants or other folks bring documents to the meeting, and if they're discussed, then we do say you should ask them for copies. If you can't get copies, you should indicate in the minutes this document was brought by the applicant and a copy was requested. If they don't give you a copy.
It's a question on physically present, and I think I know the answer, but I still want to make sure I'm clear. Committee on Roads and Right-of-Way. So we're looking at maps and things of that sort, the town's GIS system. I will frequently whistle up a map because we're in a room with Wi-Fi and project it. It's not a paper copy. Is that physically present?
Yes. I mean, I would indicate that you looked at an electronic copy of this document. The idea being that someone can go after the fact and know what it is that informed the decisions that were being made. Okay? I mean, I can't tell you that I know that the AG has ever ruled on this, but I think of the analogy where I have some communities where, for example, the selectmen's packets are all electronic. They're never actually printed out on paper. They all have their iPads at the meeting, and that's what, to me, those are all physically present, right? And they list them all. God bless you. I have communities, maybe you folks do this, that actually put the entire selectmen's packet up online with the meeting agenda.
We do, and we have a policy that encourages all other boards and committees.
So Erica confirmed that, yes, the Board of Selectmen does do that here and that they encourage other boards and committee members to do that. I get that there are some things like those great big plans that are difficult to do that. But, that, as Erica said, that's the recommendation to boards and committees. By the way, any document used, as we've defined it at a public meeting, at an open meeting, is presumed to be a public record, just so you know. All right, so executive session meeting minutes. The new, not so new now, 5-year-old open meeting law does put the responsibility on the chair to cause to occur a regular review of executive session meeting minutes to determine whether or not the purpose for the executive session has been satisfied and that the meeting minutes can be released. This never used to happen, right? There was no requirement under the old open meeting law to do this. And so there'd be executive session, and we'd be done, and 10 years would go by, and no one would ever look at those minutes again. The law is requiring now that the boards undertake periodic reviews, and it's technically the chair's responsibility to cause this to be done, to review your executive session meetings minutes to determine whether or not the purpose, the reason why you had to hold the meeting out of the open has been satisfied. If you have a question, ask administration. It's typically the general reasons why you go in executive session litigation. Well, once the case is completely over and all appeal periods have run, typically at that point, the minutes ought to be released. Lots of caveats, though. Even with executive session, even when the purpose for the executive session has been satisfied, there may be types of information that we would say ought to be redacted before there's any public release. Attorney-client information, personal, private information of a highly intimate nature, employee discipline. I mean, there are things that we might not want out there and that we can legitimately withhold or redact from disclosure, even once the rest of the minutes, it's been determined that the purpose for the executive session has been satisfied and the meeting minutes need to be released. By release, I don't mean, though, a vote by the board, executive session minutes can be released. I'm not suggesting, unless Erica tells me this is what the selectmen's policy is, I'm not suggesting you go run out and put them on the website. The purpose of this evaluation is to ensure that if someone walks in and says, I want the executive session minutes for XYZ meeting, that you're able to respond accurately. That's okay for release, or no, that's still being withheld. That means that this review has to happen more than once, right? As time goes on, you may need to revisit prior determinations. My suggestion to folks is start July 1st, 2010, work your way forward, get that in order. Right? Make your determinations on any executive sessions that have occurred since July 1st, 2010. Because that's when this requirement came into effect. I have taken the position that, prior to July 1st, 2010, if you get a public records request for executive session minutes, that's when you can go through the process of evaluating and determining whether or not they ought to be revealed. I will tell you the AG doesn't necessarily agree with me, but we haven't quite gotten a final determination sort of is whether they're, in what circumstances I'm right or the AG's right. But from a very practical perspective, I think you need to focus on July 1st forward in the first instance. Get that in order, right? And make sure your open session minutes are done and approved from July 1st, 2010 forward, if they aren't already. I'm not going to go into too much about the public records aspect, but understand that when someone asks for meeting minutes, whether they be executive or open session meeting minutes, that request is covered under both the open meeting law and the public records law. So there's two avenues that someone can appeal if they don't like your answer. So it's important to another reason why it's important to be on top of these things.
And so it leads to a question I have, and I'm just clarifying that, of a situation where the chair decided 7 minutes, and this is an open meeting, 7 minutes is not to be disseminated. Which would, okay, so I don't post them on the website, but she doesn't want me sending them to the commissioners, they're not to go to the public, but the public can still request those minutes, and I have 10 days to respond and release those minutes to them, even in draft form.
So open session meeting minutes are public records. I am unaware of a appropriate situation where those minutes would not be disseminated to the other members of a board. The law does not require that open session minutes be posted on a website. Okay? Many towns do that, right? And quite frankly, it's a practical issue. I'm not calling the town clerk. I'm not calling a clerical staff person to a board to get meeting minutes. I can go on the website, open session minutes. I don't know of any reason how you could dictate that they would not be made available. But if I'm understanding the question, it sounds like there is a policy or protocol in town that open session meeting minutes get uploaded to some electronic site. That's not something that's technically governed under the open meeting law. So I can't say to you that it's required.
I guess these are open minutes, and it's almost as if she's treating them as an executive session minute, when in fact they're not. So if you wanted a copy of those minutes, do I have to go, okay, here they are, here's the draft of the minutes, or do I have the 10 days?
So, okay, so...
And how, if somebody requests those minutes that she's reviewing and holding.
So why don't we talk about that a little more at the break, because that's a very narrow type of issue, okay?
When I worked in Missouri, we had something called the Sunshine Law, same deal. But our university nominated one office for records release, so that we had a request for information. They all focused through one office. It was a legal counsel's office. Does Nantucket prefer that each of us be responsible for the release, or would they prefer to go through a single focus?
So the question has to do with whether or not there is a policy or protocol in place for responding to public records requests. I don't know. Before Erica answers, I will tell you that I do encourage this to the extent that that is practically feasible in town. So one of my towns that was getting a bazillion public records requests, we ultimately developed a protocol where all such requests were directed to the town clerk for logging, if you will. And then it would be disseminated back to the appropriate body or department head to respond. And that was really a tracking mechanism, and it worked in this particular community. Whether or not that's how you prefer things to be done, I like to know, although usually public records requests that come into the police department, they tend to handle, and I don't know how Nantucket does it, but in general, my experience with police departments is they've got records clerks, and they tend to respond to those without necessarily having them go through town hall. But I'd like to have sort of a central office at least be aware of what the public records requests are that are coming in and able to track that a response has gone out in a timely manner. And so Erica commented that that sort of central clearinghouse would be town administration. But I just need to be clear, have you folks actually, yeah. Okay. So stay tuned. We've touched a little bit on public records, right? So there are requirements for maintaining some of the records we've talked about. The state has issued records retention schedules for pretty much every document that ever comes in the door of town government. Meeting minutes, as I mentioned earlier, must be maintained permanently. You have to be able to find them. I had a requester that came in and asked for every Board of Selectmen meeting minute dating back to 1865. To my shock, they found them, they had them all but 1 year. And we don't know why we didn't have that 1 year, but, you know, there's floods, there's fires, there's plenty of reasons why we might not have had it. But I was amazed. And they were pulling out the books with the handwritten minutes, right? You know, I don't have all of my records in my office. If I need a record that's 10 years old, I got to go off site to the archives, and they yell at me because it costs money to pull them from the archives. Public records, you know, there's not a lot of consideration for space issues, cost issues. You are not allowed to substitute electronic databases for hard copies. You can keep them as the backup. But they have not yet, and the state has been grappling with this for probably a decade, about whether or not keeping only electronic versions of records is acceptable under what circumstances. It's an ongoing discussion. Is it common for minutes to be maintained on a computer and, you know, you print them out when someone asks for them? That's pretty common. But I had a public records request recently for, I think it was 5 years. It went back to the July 1st, 2010, 5 years of meeting minutes for the selectmen. And we couldn't find like 10 or 12 sets. And they think it was because computers got swapped out and something crashed. And so I'm waiting to get the slap on the wrist from the AG because we're supposed to have meeting minutes. So, you need to be mindful of sort of how you're maintaining your meeting minutes, especially if IT comes knocking on the door saying, we're going to swap out that computer. You need to be careful of that you've retrieved stuff on the hard drive. Agendas, meeting notices need to be kept for 1 year. Notices to individuals of executive session. This is probably going to apply to fewer of you than more. But if you go into executive session under purpose, I'm going to say purpose 1, not exemption 1, there's some notification to an individual that is going to be discussed at that executive session that needs to be made. Those are the notices that are required to be kept for 6 years. And open meeting law complaints 3 years. Remember, though, you're not allowed to just unilaterally destroy public records. You're supposed to get the permission of the state. So after the appropriate period for retention expires, you can make application to the state to destroy things. I don't know if that ever happens. I often get the call from somebody, oh yeah, well, we were shredding some documents. And I kind of cringe a little bit because I know nobody's asked the state for that permission.
What happens if you have a former secretary of our board had a computer from which he could not extract images? Fortunately, all the minutes exist in emails that he sent to me so that I can distribute them. What happens if you have a situation where you have them digitally and all of a sudden one day you don't have them?
That's bad.
That's bad. What are the penalties?
So, I have to tell you that, quite frankly, penalties aren't that great right now. But things like meeting minutes are the things that we need to be very careful about because they are your bylaws, your charters. I mean, those are essential governmental documents, and you're supposed to be maintaining them permanently. And so you need to safeguard them. Like I said, I'm waiting to hear back from the Attorney General about this Board of Selectmen that couldn't find, 12 sets of meeting minutes. I don't know what they're going to say.
Should we be, once they are draft minutes and then once they are approved minutes, to be safe, we should be printing them out, keeping that with some sort of...
Absolutely. So the question had to do with, when we have minutes in electronic form and they're final, should we be printing them out? Yes. Practically, do I think everybody does? I think a lot of people are relying on the electronic version, but it's not in a pinch. You can print it out if you've got it, but if you lose the electronic, whether you lose access or the computer crashes or whatever, then you don't have minutes, and that's not good. What that's going to translate to into an actual penalty or fine is less of an issue, quite frankly, than how that looks to the public, because you'll get castigated for this. So I space permitting. I mean, the supervisor of public records that governs public records, basically tells you that you should be printing out everything, every email. I don't do that. Nobody does that, right? But they tell you should be printing out these things and maintaining the hard copies. You have to find your balance between complying with your public records and your open meeting law requirements and your technology and your space. You got to figure that out, but that's a balance that has to happen internally.
Really quick, agendas and meetings. I read somewhere that you're supposed to keep whatever notes you use for the meeting minutes.
So the question is, do you have to keep notes for meeting minutes? If someone is taking notes in order to prepare the meeting minutes, once the meeting minutes are approved, you don't have to keep the notes, right? Now, again, I think people start to tape because it's easier, right? All right, so I've just given you some links to some guides, the Open Meeting Law Guide, Public Records Guide, some bulletins there, just in case you want to do what I call insomniac reading. For those folks that are on boards, though, I do recommend you read the Open Meeting Law Guide, if you haven't. Anybody that gets on a board is supposed to be given a packet of information from the clerk when they first take office, and maybe periodically thereafter, but you are expected to be familiar with the open meeting law requirements.
We also have a link for that on the town's website.
Link for that on the town's website. Just a couple things that I've reprinted, but I've on the slides, but I've also given you in the handouts. These are my templates for meeting minutes, right? I've got one for open, I've got one for executive. This is just my suggestion to you about how you do your minutes. This is not something that's required by law, that, you know, that this format is required, but I tried to put something together because I had enough questions from folks about what should be in meeting minutes that I wanted to give them kind of a little, here, you can set it up like this. That should get you what you need, okay? Both on these two slides, the handouts themselves have a footnote on it, which just appears elsewhere in these slides. That's why it's not, and I ran out of room. And then you also have Attorney General checklists. They've got checklists for the meeting notice, meeting minutes, and one other that for executive session as well. I really didn't think we were going to go the full 2 hours. You guys have been great for asking questions. Does anybody have any questions that they want to pose while the group is here as sort of follow-up? All right, I'm going to have some time now before the next session to answer any individual question that folks have. Thanks for staying awake, folks. I know that this is not necessarily what one would call the most scintillating of topics, but I appreciate your participation and your attention. Thank you.